I would like to continue by moving on to the second passion and resurrection prediction in the Gospel of Mark. We saw the first one in Mark chapter 8, verse 31, and that one was more detailed than the second one, which we will see in a moment. They went through Galilee. The reason why Jesus does not want anyone besides his disciples to know that they are going through Galilee is because now teaching his disciples privately takes precedence over teaching publicly. Now the disciples have got to be very attentive. We notice now Jesus does not talk to the disciples in parables. He will not talk to others in parables except when he enters Jerusalem in chapter 12. And that is really a parable in which he speaks about himself almost and what is going to happen to him. So here, all the sayings and all the talk now of Jesus is plainly, that is without ambiguity and without parables, because Jesus was teaching his disciples. This teaching refers to a continuous teaching. It doesn't mean he simply taught them once and then he stopped. No, the fact that Mark uses teaching his disciples is to indicate that it is a continuous lesson that he gives again and again and again. Even though Mark does not give us too many details about the groups, he simply speaks about human hands, that is in a way as opposed to God's hand, you might say. He uses the term betrayed, which here is translated betrayed. The Greek is paradidomi, and paradidomi is translated differently in the different contexts. For example, in John chapter 3, verse 16, we read, "For God so loved the world that he paradidomi." There, the translation is gave. So paradidomi might be translated as handed over, as gave, as betrayed. In the sense of John 3:16, when John uses paradidomi, he means God gave as a gift. Here, the sense which Jesus uses paradidomi is that he will be betrayed. And notice, for the second time, and as far as I'm concerned, this shows the faith of Jesus, the use of the active verb for rise. Not he will be raised, but he will rise again, because Jesus has faith in God. Jesus knows that God will raise him, and that is why he can talk with this kind of confidence even in the active verb. Mark says here that they did not understand what he was saying, but then he adds, and they were afraid to ask him. My interpretation of this verse is that they did not want to understand, and that is why they were afraid to ask. Because if they asked, he would explain, he would explicate. As a matter of fact, by Mark telling us earlier on that he was continuously teaching, Mark is saying very clearly that the teaching, and we saw in 6:6b, that the teaching of Jesus was in villages. In chapter 1, verses 21 and 22, we were told he taught with authority. So when Mark uses that Jesus was teaching, it cannot be that the disciples would not have understood, because Jesus would have explicated, Jesus would have made very, very explicit and clear what was happening. So my own interpretation of this verse is that they did not want to understand, which led to their fear to ask him, because the moment they knew what he was about, then they would have to follow that way. Also, we notice that what follows is an indication that they did not want to know. And notice here, I've highlighted the phrase on the way because it is only in the Gospel of Mark that all of this takes place very explicitly and specifically mentioned by Mark on the way. The house is a place where Jesus gives private instructions to the disciples. Earlier on, we saw in chapter 7, verses 1 to 13, when Jesus talked about external and internal cleanness. When Jesus entered the house, they asked him about the parable. So the house is like a theological topos for Mark, where private instruction is also given. Here, the question is raised by Jesus. And the question is, notice, what were you arguing about? It is one thing to discuss, and Jesus would have been aware if they were discussing. But when Jesus asked, what were you arguing about? It's an indication that there may have been raised voices, that there may have been being aggressive. That is possibly what he realized and what he interpreted as their arguing. And when he uses this phrase, what were you arguing about on the way? One must also read a little deeper because this is Mark's section of the way. So you might say, what were you arguing about on the way which I have just told you about? So what were you arguing about on my way of life? Given the fact that the disciples were afraid to ask Jesus, notice they are discussing other matters. So it is likely that they possibly would have got something about rising from the dead and then about the kingdom which they would inherit because Jesus was so confident. The reason for their silence, as even earlier on, is because they know that they had not done right. They know that they had really taken what Jesus had said to the other extreme. They had understood, but they did not want to understand. Jesus, however, because he still considers them as insiders, because he still considers them as open, because he still considers them as not against him, will teach them. The sitting down is to assume the posture of a rabbi. The calling, once again, like we saw in chapter 3, verse 13, Jesus called to him those whom he wanted. In chapter 8, verse 34, Jesus called the crowd. So the calling also is indicative now of an important lesson. And this lesson is that the first must be last and servant of all. Now, unfortunately, because of the fact that so very often we have misunderstood this or we have not understood this, we unfortunately have not taken this lesson to heart. If we are genuine in our vocation, then we must keep in mind that before we can be ordained as priests, we are ordained as deacons. Now, the diaconate is not merely one step before the priesthood. The permanent diaconate is a place where a person would never become a priest. So therefore, the diaconate must not be interpreted as now I am a deacon, the next step is a priest. No, the diaconate is a reminder. It is like a pricking of your conscience to tell you that even as a priest, you are meant to serve. Now, this, very, very unfortunately, is forgotten by so very many today. In the old days, we used to talk of becoming a teacher or a priest as a vocation. And even today, at least the language we use is vocation promotion, and it is used specifically for calls to priesthood and religious life. While we generally talk about my vocation as a doctor or as a teacher, that is not so common. However, I am not so sure whether everyone thinks of the priesthood as a vocation or whether some think of it as a profession. And what do I mean by this? If you look at the life of, let us say, 95% of us who are priests, I could even talk about 99.9, but I'm just being conservative and saying 95. Talk about 95% of us who are priests, and look at the kind of lives we lead now as compared to when we were lay people. Which one of you, even as a seminarian, had the privilege of switching off your phone, of having a siesta in the afternoon, of closing your door and putting outside "do not disturb"? Which one of you had the privilege of all of these when you were living as a layperson? Which one of you had the privilege to say that in the year 2025, COVID or no COVID, I, because I'm a priest or because I'm a religious, will have my lunch at 12:30 in the afternoon and I will have salad on the table? Was it possible for you to say that as a layperson? And you know, you have companions who are in school and college with you. You have companions who are there out in the field, I would say, who are working and saying to you, "I've lost my job. They have made me redundant. They have let me go." And you have companions who are traveling maybe 4-5 hours a day to go and come, working 10 hours a day, sleeping 5 or 6 hours a day. So where is the question of being servant of all, of being slave of all? Where is the question of my being a deacon as one who serves? And so therefore, what we must keep in mind is this, that no matter what, we are privileged. And this privilege is so noticeable in a time like this. It is always noticeable, but in a time like this, in this COVID-19 situation, let me be very, very honest and frank with you, the priests and religious are the most comfortable of all. We can put ourselves on the level of the very, very top elite of society. Just like the elite have time for exercise, and the elite have time for entertainment, and the elite have time for this and that, we also. And so the question is, how must we interpret the statement of Jesus today that the first must be last? Those of you who want to be master and mistress must be those who will serve and be servant and slave. And the reason why Jesus brings a little child is because the child, while a symbol of innocence, while a symbol of purity, while a symbol of spontaneity, was primarily a symbol of dependence. Unlike today, when we treat children with such respect, at the time of Jesus, children were pushed right into the background. They not only had not to be heard, but not even to be seen. If a Roman wanted to adopt, the Roman would adopt a youth and not a child. Children were too difficult. Let them be away. The less they were seen, the less they heard, the better. Out of sight, out of mind. That is how a child was treated in antiquity. And so when Jesus brings this child, he shocks them. Today, we hold children in our arms. Well, at least we could do that before COVID-19. And we regard them as so innocent, as so spontaneous, and so on. But that was hardly what was thought of. The child had to depend on the parent for every single thing. And this is primarily what Jesus is doing when he brings the child. And Jesus, as only Jesus could do, identifies himself with the child because he identifies himself with his own dependence on God. If I were to define, besides many other qualities as we know, one quality of Jesus that stood out, it would be his childlikeness. And by childlikeness, I mean his acknowledgement at every moment of his dependence on God. If this is one quality that we can assimilate from the Lord, I think it will be a fantastic thing. Because I realize then who I am. Really, I am nothing, I am no one. Then our minds go back to 8:34 of the Gospel of Mark, where he says, if you want to be a disciple, deny yourself. This is what it means to be a child. And because Jesus was, in a way, a child, because he could become a child, he could say that. So he said only what he practiced himself. John is the one who sees, let me go back to the text, 9:38 to 41. John, who was one of those who was on the mountain of transfiguration, when they came down, we remember that the other 9 who were there could not cast out the demon from the epileptic boy. James, John, and Peter were with Jesus on the mountain. And here, John is becoming the representative of the group to stop someone from casting out demons in the name of Jesus. Why? And notice what John says very presumptuously. He says it very presumptuously. What does he say? He was not following us. Earlier on, we remember that Jesus had told Peter, get behind me. In other words, he reminded Peter that Peter was a follower, not a leader. Here, John does something similar. Instead of saying he's not following you because they also are following the Lord, they're not leading anyone, John tries to be presumptuous here and says, because you were not following us. You see, earlier on, he's aware that the demons are being cast out in the name of the Lord. So casting out demons in your name. And we try to stop him. So if Jesus had tried to stop him, it was another story. But notice, so John tries to involve himself. So Jesus has just spoken about becoming a child. And see, John, one of the chosen 3, has forgotten the lesson. Has forgotten the lesson. It is his pride. He wants to be there. He wants to be one of the leaders. In Numbers, we also read something similar, where Joshua tries to stop Eldad and Medad, and Moses asks him not to stop them. Jesus, however, is inclusive, as we saw, even in his dealing with the Syrophoenician woman, even in the feeding of the 4,000, he is inclusive. And what is important as far as Jesus is concerned is that good is being done. And we might remember that this was the stand of Jesus even earlier when he asked, for example, in the synagogue on the Sabbath, is it lawful to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill? So here, it's a deed of power. And it is helpful for somebody, so let it be. That is the way it must be. We must be inclusive. We cannot be exclusive. And here is how Jesus shows this inclusivity. Namely, if somebody is not against, that person is for. Luke has two of these statements. In the 950, Luke has got a very strong statement where Luke says, if anyone is not for us, he or she is against us. But Matthew 12:30 and Luke 11:23 have got the similar saying from Mark that if anyone is not against, they are for. So we are not going to be aggressive. We are going to be inclusive. This is the stand which Jesus takes. In chapter 9, verses 42 to 50, one might say that Mark gives what might call his community discourse. The community discourse of the Gospel of Matthew is in chapter 18, verses 1 to 35, in which Matthew speaks about how Christians must behave in community. Mark takes one specific point, which is known as scandalos, that is scandal, translated in English as stumbling block. The word stumbling block in English is from the Greek skandalos, which means do not be a scandal, do not be cause of scandal. In other words, let not your behavior be the cause of somebody else sinning. Now, while it is true that on the general level, each one has to accept responsibility for their actions, it is also true that when we are in a position of authority, when we have been given a position in society, that people will look up to us, that people will follow us. Let me give you an example of your own life. If you had remained a layperson, it is likely that a few people in the place where you worked, a few people in your neighborhood may have been inspired by you and may have tried to imitate you in some way or another. However, when you become a priest or if you are a religious, then you are exposed to thousands of people. When you celebrate Mass in a church, and we hope that they will come soon, there are 500-600 people who are there watching you, hearing you, seeing you. And as time goes by, some of those people will try to pick up some of your qualities, some of your traits, because they find it so inspiring. And others will hear what you say and will follow what you say. They will follow your way of life simply because you are there and you are now a public figure. And that's why you have to be more responsible than others. In the old days, the priest did not opt to become a priest. The priest was chosen from within the community. Something similar will happen at your ordination. When a lay person will be asked to speak before on the ordination day, a lay person will be asked by the bishop to say whether that person, on behalf of the community, thinks that you are worthy. Of course, you will not be worthy, but thinks that you can be graced enough to accept this responsibility and this enormous privilege. So something of that remains. But nowadays, we are the ones who join in a sense. And therefore, I would think we are even more responsible because we have opted for this life where we become public figures, where people see us who would never have seen us if we were not priests. And so we need to ask ourselves whether we are those stumbling blocks where people are inspired by us, or people go away from the Lord because of us. And here, I do not want to stress so much the faith in a particular religion. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about whether people are so not inspired by us or so scandalized by us, as the text here is saying, that they move away from the Lord. And so very hyperbolic, strong language is used by Jesus, because if you, and notice the little ones, who are these little ones in this context, because it is the context of the child, while it might be chronological children, we have to go beyond that. Now we go beyond that. And who are the little ones whom Jesus is talking about here? Those who are just learning the faith. Those who are weak in their faith. Those who are marginalized. Those who are on the fringes of society. The poor. They are the ones. So the little ones in this context whom we can scandalize are the ones who are on the fringes of Christian society, and who are the marginalized, who no one cares about, and especially in so many of our parishes and institutions, these are the ones who are left out, left behind. Because unless you actively go after them, they will never be noticed. They cannot be noticed because they are too frightened to be noticed. So it's you who have got to take the responsibility. In Matthew chapter 18, when Jesus tells in the context of the community discourse there, the parable of the lost sheep, his ending in Matthew's gospel is quite different from the ending in Luke. In Matthew, this is how Jesus ends the parable when he says, "It is not the will of my Father that even one of these little ones should be lost." So the lost sheep in Matthew is the little one who was scandalized and went astray, who was not cared for and went astray, who was not considered and went astray, whom nobody looked at, nobody bothered about, and so went astray. So notice, it is the responsibility of the community. Here, Jesus is talking to the disciples. So we are the ones whom the Lord is talking about, and we must accept that responsibility. And the punishment which Jesus talks is very severe, and everyone will be tested. Being salted with fire means that we are constantly being tested. And in Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 to 16, Jesus uses two metaphors immediately after the Beatitudes, which begin the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5, 3 to 12. The next verses are the use of two metaphors by Jesus, namely, you are the salt of the earth, you are the light of the world. Notice, Jesus does not say, you are like the salt of the earth, you are like the light. No, that would be a simile. But the metaphor is, you are salt, you are light. Now, sometimes we have interpreted salt to mean the functions of salt. Salt is used to add taste. Salt is used as a preservative. Salt is used in sacrifice. Salt is even used because it has got some healing properties. Salt is used when you have a sore throat to gargle and so on. You see? Gargle with salt water, they say. So these are functions. These are uses. This is not what Jesus is saying. And similarly here, notice he gives the answer here. What does you are salt of the earth mean? He is talking about the intrinsic quality of salt. And what is the intrinsic quality of salt? What makes salt salt? Saltiness. And Jesus says the same thing in the Gospel of Matthew. You are the salt of the earth, but the salt loses its saltiness. How can you make it salty again? It is of no use. Then you cannot use it to add taste. You cannot use it to gargle when you have a sore throat. You cannot use it in sacrifice. You cannot use it to preserve because there is no saltiness in that salt. And so when Jesus says, salt is good, but if salt has lost, so he's telling you, you are good. But if you have lost your intrinsic quality of Jesus-likeness, then what is the use? So we have to be that alter Christus, that other Christ. When people see us, when people encounter us, this is what they must see. They must see the Lord. So you continue to have salt, continue to be that intrinsic salty Christian Jesus. That is the challenge. And once again, we remember when he spoke about the call, Mark, of James and John, he talked about them mending their net. The last phrase here, be at peace with one another, is also communal living. In the time of Jesus, in the Roman and Greek society, divorce was not considered a big problem at all. While it was not common to divorce, there was no social stigma attached to a woman who was divorced. Both men and women could initiate divorce in Roman and Greek society. Often it was the men who initiated divorce, but the woman had a right. And often it was through a male relative, a cousin, a brother, through whom the woman would start also divorce proceeding, and largely in cases of adultery or if the woman was infertile. Divorce in Jewish and cultural context. In the Jewish context, while divorce was allowed, the prime reason of Deuteronomy 24 was not so that a man could divorce his wife. No, a man could not remarry the woman whom he had divorced if she had married somebody else and that person had divorced her. So, in a certain sense, while it is taken for granted that you could divorce, what was focused in Deuteronomy 24 1 to 4 was the procedure. Namely, a woman has to be given as far as possible her rights as well. But it could be taken for granted that divorce had been allowed, and Jesus will give us the reason why divorce was allowed, you might say, when they come to him with the question. Now, when Jesus is teaching, even on his way to Jerusalem, it is an indication that he's explicating, and even though Mark does not give us the content of the teaching, we could say that the teaching is possibly about the evangelion and about the good news. Now, notice already, they come to test him. And the reason why they came to test him was possibly the background was Herod Antipas, who had married his half brother's wife. So if Jesus says a person should not divorce, then it could be that he was against Herod like John the Baptist was. So this is possibly the background about this testing him. Is it lawful? They are asking, notice, is it lawful? It is allowed, they know, but is it lawful for a man? Notice they focus on man. You don't focus on man divorcing the wife and the wife divorcing the husband. No, a man to divorce his wife. And notice, Matthew will add for any reason. And Matthew 19:9, like Matthew 5:32, twice that's called the doublet, Matthew 5:32 and Matthew 19:9, it's called the doublet when the same verse or a similar verse appears twice in the same gospel. That is called the doublet. Matthew has 22 doublets. Mark has only one doublet. So this is one of the 22 doublets in the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew 5:32, Matthew 19:9, where Matthew gives a cause for divorce, that is unchastity, from the Hebrew zenut and from the Greek porneia, which is translated as unchastity, sometimes translated as adultery. So the question is not about grounds for divorce, but whether divorce was allowed. And Jesus is aware of Deuteronomy. So Jesus is aware about Deuteronomy. And so the question, what did Moses command you, basically would be interpreted to mean what is written in Deuteronomy. And they speak about, even though they mistranslate it, Moses allowed a man. So notice the word allowed is a concession. So very clearly, Moses allowed them because they were hard of hearts. That's what Jesus says. And at the time of Jesus, there were two schools of thought, two schools of rabbis who had tremendous followers. One was Shammai. And the school of Shammai followed what Matthew had said, namely, a man can divorce his wife if she is unchaste or if she commits adultery. There was another school, the school of Hillel. And the school of Hillel said a man can divorce his wife for any reason whatever. If he came home for a meal and he found that she had spoiled the dish, she had either burnt it or overcooked it, he could divorce her. If he was walking on the street and he saw a woman who was better than he thought, better than his wife, he could divorce his wife. So any reason, the school of Hillel. The school of Shammai, only unchastity. So this is the prevalent situation at the time of Jesus. When Jesus responds, it was a concession given to the people, not because Moses wanted to, but because Moses thought that something worse would have happened if he had not allowed. Moral theologians, and when you study moral theology, you will study what is known as the choice of the lesser evil. And sometimes the choice is of the lesser. Both are not good choices. So, for example, there is a woman and this example is often given, who is expecting a baby and she is on the delivery table. And because of complications which the woman has, the doctor says to the husband, I cannot save both your wife and the baby. I can save only one. Notice, both the choices are not good. Why should even one die? Yes, but now the question is, which do you choose? So in this case, you could apply this law, this moral theology idea of choosing the lesser evil. So Moses possibly would have assumed that the lesser evil is to allow the person to divorce, rather than a man bringing another woman into his house and creating problems for his first wife. However, Jesus does not go to Deuteronomy. He goes back to Genesis and the beginning of creation. This is what God intended. God intended the coming together. And we see here even what we can understand today, and we must take this to married people. And I think it's an important point, namely the threefold pattern. First is the doing away. I am moving away from my former life. Leaving father and mother should also indicate to the couple leaving the former life. The clinging to each other, that is the two becoming one. The clinging is not only a physical clinging, but even a spiritual, emotional, mental clinging. This, I think, in a way, summarizes what marriage is. Jesus is very clear that God has ordained it, and so they must obey God's command. Once again, the question is asked in the house. And Jesus here goes by the Roman and Greek practice. He talks about a man divorcing his wife, and also about a woman divorcing her husband. As far as Jesus is concerned, divorce in Mark is definitely not allowed.